Hi everyone. So, we are starting to get some responses in relation to Batman Arkham Knight's performance issues on PC directly from, well, community moderators over at Warner Bros. Games forums. Now, Yorick, one of the community admins, has posted what they probably thought at the time was going to be really helpful to the community, but appears to really have just insulted us even more. So, what are they saying? Well, for all intents and purposes, they're saying that it's all down to PC gamers not following the recommended specs to make sure this game works as well as the developers basically intended, i.e. 30 frames a second. So listen to this. This is the specs that they're saying you should use within the game settings if you are on minimum hardware specs. Resolution 1280 by 720. VSync off, anti-aliasing off, textures low, quality shadows low, level of detail low, fog off. This is the NVIDIA effects, by the way. NVIDIA effects, fog off, paper debris off, enhanced rain off, enhanced light shafts off. Expected 30 frames per second capped. Now, we might say to ourselves, okay, 30 frames a second capped, that's okay. If we were talking about 1080p here, but we're not. We're talking about 1280 720. Can anyone recall the last time a monitor was sold at 1280 720 as its native resolution? Utterly absurd. So let's now move on to their next kind of issue here. And they're basically saying that if you have a video card with 2 gig of RAM, 3 gig if you're on AMD, then you have to have your textures set to low. Have you seen the texture quality of this game? The low textures are atrocious, and I'm gobsmacked they couldn't fit them into just half a gig of RAM, let alone requiring 2 gig or 3 gig. It's just bonkers and truly unacceptable, really, especially when we now know that, for instance, the rain texture mapping on PS4 is missing on PC. Essentially, when Batman gets hit with nice water, we don't really see any of it on the costume, which is why the costume looks so bland and, well, crap, really. Now, let's move on to the recommended specs, because we would expect the recommended specs to, well, be all your bells and whistles. That's what we'd kind of expect, wouldn't we? So, resolution 1920 by 1080. Great. VSync on. Okay. Anti-aliasing on. Great, although some control over the anti-aliasing would have been good. Texture resolution, normal. Shadow quality, normal. Level of detail, normal. Now, I'm playing the game on these normal settings, and the game looks bloody awful. I mean, really poor. Interactive smoke and fog, off. Paper debris, off. Enhanced rain, off. Enhanced light shafts, off. Expected, 30 frames per second capped. Right. I mean, what we basically have here is a game that physically cannot run over 30 frames a second without encountering a wide range of different problems. And as we've been noting for the last 24 hours, it doesn't seem to matter if you have a 970 or a 980 GPU, the very fastest things that NVIDIA are pushing out into the consumer market, or even a Titan. The performance here is simply unacceptable. Now, they then go on to say that with the recommended specs, AMD users will encounter texture pop-in, loading symbols during fast-paced scenarios, hitches and stuttering when gliding or driving the Batmobile. To help alleviate this, AMD users using recommended spec GPUs should turn texture resolution, shadow quality and level of detail to low. Right, so your recommended hardware specs are not actually your recommended hardware specs when applied to AMD, and I would barely say that your recommended hardware specs even apply to bloody NVIDIA, because as we're seeing, these recommended specs are hopelessly low, barely coming up to the quality of the PS4 because we've got bits missing in the way texture mapping is being applied to rain effects, for instance. What you basically have here is a game that's just completely balked. And then, to add insult to injury, they actually tried to teach us to suck eggs by saying, we do not recommend that users change anything in the game's INI files, as this will potentially negatively impact performance, including frame rate and stability. It couldn't be made much worse, guys. Can it? I mean, seriously, the stability of the game is atrocious, especially if you turn on those NVIDIA effects on NVIDIA cards, and, well, the frame rate is atrocious anyway. So we're barely getting above 30 frames a second. In fact, even with the 30 frames a second cap, I'm seeing the game dipping into the 24s. That's great. Extra cinematic. But at the end of the day, where they really blow their load on this one is, at this time, we do not recommend using NVIDIA's GeForce Experience or AMD's Gaming Evolved optimization tools. Right, so basically they're saying that the driver manufacturers, the card manufacturers, have assessed this game, pushed out their recommended specs using the tuning tools, and apparently Warner Brothers doesn't feel those are accurate either. Would that be because they've pretty much just shoved everyone to the lowest settings to attempt to get a stable frame rate? We do seem to have a bit of a mismatch here. On the one hand, Warner Brothers is saying, oh, you need to do all of these things exactly as we've said it, and then the driver manufacturers are turning around and actually saying, nah, that isn't actually going to work on our cards, and so they're recommending a completely different set of specs that essentially lowers everything down to underneath the quality of the consoles. They are also recommending that people use the latest drivers, and they say that they're currently looking to improve streaming performance from mechanical hard drives. Those are ones which have a spinning platter inside them. And for comedy, they note that for users that have an SSD available, we've noted increased streaming performance when the game is installed to that type of drive. Would that be stating the bleeding obvious there, I think? Possibly quite a bit, I'd say. So then they basically go on to list all the things that aren't really working on the kind of more complex side of gaming hardware. For instance, Crossfire on AMD isn't working, iInfinity is not currently really working, it's not supported, and will be addressed in a future driver update. And when running SLI using NVIDIA's system, you can only set one card as a dedicated physics card, and that may improve performance. So in other words, don't use the SLI for SLI, instead use your really expensive extra card just to handle physics calculations. Presumably we've got some CPU bound issues here with the game, where effectively it's bottlenecking with the physics. This might explain some of the issues we've been seeing with the Batmobile at particular high action moments. Effectively the physics is having to work on things like debris and all sorts of other stuff within the game world, obviously to a much lower level than we would see with having those NVIDIA features turned on, but it could be that's where the bottleneck is coming from. Now interestingly, they've then revised those requirements again, or restated them. At the high end, if you want to supposedly be able to run this at 30 frames a second without texture tears and all sorts of other problems going on, you are going to need a graphics card with 4GB of RAM. That's probably going to be a GTX 980, and you're going to need a Core i7 at 3.4 GHz or above. Now these are really beefy specs. These are the sort of beefy specs that run Grand Theft Auto 5 at 60 frames a second and above without a problem, that run Witcher 3 at 60 frames a second or above without any problem. What the heck is wrong with this game that it requires so much power yet still cannot break free from that 30 frames per second cap without significant problems? At the end of the day, we are dealing with the worst console port I think we've seen in a very long time. This reminds me of Watch Dogs all over again, a game that has effectively been given a massive graphical downgrade to bring it to PC at all because of whatever concessions were made to get this running on console. For all intents and purposes, I'd say that this port was done in probably a couple of months, and all of the time and effort really went into the console games, with the game then shoved across to some third-party developers to release a PC version of it. In order to do that, they've had to cut features and functionality from the engine to get this running. So, for instance, that rain texture effect missing in the PC version but present in the PS4. Right now, if you've bought this game from Steam, if you've bought it from a third-party retailer on a credit card, you would be much better off doing a chargeback, asking for a refund and getting your money back. If you're concerned that you don't have the legal right to do that, well, let me tell you, in the UK certainly, and within the EU, you have every right to request a refund for a product which is not of merchantable quality. This game is not of merchantable quality, and we can prove that, and the developers themselves have proved that with this missive, as it were, instructing people how to actually set up the game, and then finding, well, that doesn't actually work either, and it contradicts what even the driver manufacturers are saying here. At the end of the day, this game does not meet even the most basic standard under the Sales of Goods Act. Do ask for a refund. The only way we can stop developers and publishers from pulling something like this again is to vote with our wallets and to show them that they cannot make money out of us when they pull crap like this.